Hi folks, this is Tim Garman for SIT on NZDP 101, and we're looking at the work for week 8 to 9, which is assignment C, and it's recolouring the FireTruck image. And typically this is the longest assignment in the paper, so I know that some of you were having a lot of attempts at the rotunda image we worked on in week 6. This is a longer assignment, but longer for a different reason, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail. So let's first of all get the image open. We're going to go up to File and Open as a Smart Object, and wherever you've got that stored on your computer, open that up. It's a JPEG, so it'll open up in Photoshop, but we can go into Camera Raw through the Camera Raw filter under the filter menu, and just have a look and see if there's anything to do. And there actually isn't a lot to do in this image. It's obviously a very old image. It's got a lot of damage to it, and that's part of the challenge of colouring this image. So all we're going to have a look at is clarity, and just increase the clarity a bit just to help with some of these edges that are perhaps disappearing a bit, perhaps especially in the background. If we increase the clarity, it may just help us with some of that, and also brings out some of the texture in the original print as well. So that's pretty much all we're going to do. So we're just, and having said that, it's up to you. You may feel you want to look at that a bit further. But I'm going to go OK, and we're back into Photoshop. Now the next thing we need to do is crop in a bit closer. We're going to lose the white around the margins or the background, and then just take out the margin that's on the print as well. So I'm going to go to our crop tool, and I know that this is a destructive part of the process, but we're just going to crop in closer, and we might just rotate a little bit as well. Let's just bring that down to there, and then let's think about rotating that image just slightly, maybe looking at the bottom of the print as a guide, and then just that's about okay. I think we want to get as much of the print as we can, and just lose the edge of the paper. So we double click that, and that's what we're dealing with. Now the next thing we want to do is turn the image into black and white. So I'm going to go to the Layers panel, and at the bottom of the Layers panel we've got the icons, one of which is for an adjustment layer. So we're going to click there and scroll down to black and white. And if I go back, you'll see we get into the Properties panel, and the image has gone to black and white. I'll just quickly go back to the Layers panel and show you what's happened. So we've now got at the top of our layer, or top of our layers, we've got an adjustment layer, which gives you the actual filter and a mask for that layer. So why have we turned it to black and white? Well, firstly, we've done it non-destructively. You can see in the thumbnail for the firewood truck, we've still got colour in there. So this is turning it into black and white non-destructively. And what we want to do, because we want to colour up this image, so it becomes like a hand-coloured image, we don't want that sepia colour coming through and affecting the colours that we're going to add. So we want to work in black and white. And when we go to the Properties panel, we can make some adjustments here should we want to do that. I guess there's quite a lot of browns in that original image, so I'm not convinced we need to do a lot here, but do have a look and just play with these and see what they do. We're going to be replacing the sky, so don't worry too much about trying to perhaps knock that away. Let's leave that as it is. It's dark enough in the darkest areas, so I'm pretty happy with that. So the next thing to have a look at is just taking out some of these spots and creases in the image. Now you can see there's a lot in the sky, but don't worry about the sky because we're going to replace that. So forget about dealing with all these spots in the sky for the moment. We'll look at that a different way. But what we do want to do, and if we blow up our image and have a look round, we want to try and get rid of some of these creases and hair marks and dust spots and specks as much as we can. Now I know there's a lot there, and that's one of the reasons why this particular assignment takes a long time to do. We're going to work with the clone tool, and to do that we're going to work on a separate layer so that it's non-destructive, and we're going to make sure we name our layers, get into a good habit of doing that. So what shall we call this? Spots seems to be as good a name as any, but give it a name that's meaningful for you. You don't have to follow what I'm calling these layers. So I'm dealing with the spots and dust marks and scratches that are in the foreground. So notice that the layer is on the top of the layer stack at the moment, and that's a good place for it to be for the moment. And we'll choose the clone tool. And when we choose the clone tool, let's just be aware of what's going on in our options strip. We've got a brush size, which you might have to look at, or perhaps change for different things we're going to adjust. Just make sure your opacity is at 100%. Don't want to touch the modes, so blending mode should be at normal. But the most important one is what it says under the sample menu when we're cloning. And as you will be aware, that we've got three options. The current layer, well, there's nothing on the current layer at the moment, so that's no good. So it's got to be current and below, or all layers. For the moment we could select all layers. And how big do we want our brush to be? Well, that depends on what we're going to retouch. If we're going for this scratch down here, I think probably that the size that I've got there is okay, and you'll see that hardness is on 0, so it'll have a feather to it which will help it to blend pretty nicely. So what I need to do is capture a bit of this edge in the bonnet area. So option click once there, and just click and drag down there, and hopefully that will deal with that. There's obviously a lot to do. You can just spot some of this out, just option click, option or alt I should say, option click once and then spot. And you're probably thinking there's a huge amount to do, and you'd be right. I'm just going to get that dark line there and put it over there. So yeah, you'd be right. And I have to say that some work in Photoshop is very quick. You'll find a button that does everything for you, and it's often you can do things in a few seconds. But sometimes things take a very long time. This is one of the reasons why this job is a long job. The other reason, which we'll get to in a little while, is that with an image like this, it's actually quite hard to find some of the detail and know what it is and what colour it should be, and where the edge ends and all that kind of thing. So we've got to work hard on this to make something of it. So I'm going to do a little bit more here. But the other thing with this tutorial video is that if I did everything, it's going to last about, I don't know how long, maybe 6 hours or more, or could be longer. And who wants to listen or watch a 6-hour video on retouching? So I'm going to be showing you some of the techniques for each different part of this this assignment, and it'll be enough for you to apply it to different areas of the image to improve all of it. So as you can see what I'm doing. Just going through and making as good a job as I can of anything that looks like it really shouldn't be there. So don't forget, leave the sky. Certainly in some of these darker areas the white spots really show up, so that would be a good thing to replace as much of that as you can. How much of this do you want to watch? That's the question. You get the general idea. Okay, so once you've been through all of that image, let's just let's just improve what I just did there. Let's just take a step back. So you're really looking at all the truck, particularly some of the darker areas and the shadows that show up the white spots quite well. We want to get rid of those. Some spots in the ground, in the foreground, some scratches. So you get the general idea. Also, don't forget up the power pole. And if you can tackle all those, and it'll take you a while, that will be great. Now, while I had the video paused, I spent a bit more time retouching all these spots and scratches that appear in the foreground, on the logs, on the truck cabin, and inside the truck, and also up the power pole. I probably spent about half an hour, probably no more than that, but it's looking a lot better for spending that time on it. And one other thing to point out, the layer that I've been working on, where we've done that retouching, really I want to sit that underneath our black and white layer, because that black and white adjustment layer is turning everything below it black and white. So really that retouching should be part of that process as well. So the next thing I want to do is bring the sky in. And whilst there are a number of ways of bringing skies in, we can copy and paste. Really the best way in this instance is to drag and drop that sky that you've downloaded. We can drag it directly into the image. And when we do that, you'll see it opens up instantly in Camera Raw, which is good news. Having said that, there's not a lot that I really want to do, and I think I'll leave that up to you. If you feel looking at this sky that there's something that you want to do to it, by all means make some adjustments in Camera Raw. We will be adjusting it in Photoshop to add some noise and that kind of thing. So I'm just going to click OK. So we've now got the image in. You can see it's black and white at the moment. Let's not worry about that at the moment, but let's just increase the size of the image so that it covers the whole of our FireTruck image. And just to point out that if you're on an older version of Photoshop, and I think that's something like pre-2018, you'll need to hold the Shift key down to constrain the proportions when you are reducing or enlarging an image like that. But if you're on the current version of Photoshop or a recent version, it constrains the proportions by default. So don't hold the Shift key down in that instance. Having said that, I'm going to suggest that we might want to just squash this down a bit to just add a bit more of a feel for this this sky being in the distance, particularly at the bottom of the image, just at the horizon line. So to do that on the current version, I will need to hold the Shift key down because I want to squash it down a little bit. And I don't want to do that too much for two reasons. Firstly, we don't want the clouds to look too distorted. you can get away with some distortion on clouds because they are fairly random shapes. But the other thing is we don't want to reduce the image too much in that way and start to destroy the image in terms of its quality. So that looks fine to me. I'm going to, well, one other thing I'm going to do is move it up, because we've got a lot of area in the sky at the top where there's less obvious clouds. So this area here is the part I want to use. So I want to make sure it just covers the whole of the sky in the background image. When it's in the right place, we can double click it, and then we'll think about the position in the layers palette where we want it to be above the black and white adjustment layer. So now we've got a sky in color, and if we want to see where our mask might have to go, because we're going to have to mask out this area around the truck to hide that part of the sky. So we could just reduce the opacity on that layer a bit, just to see where that is, and we can see that we're fine in our positioning of the sky. So that's fine. So we just need a mask that covers out this part of the truck. Let's put that up to 100% again. And the next step we'll need to do is just add a bit of a blur to this sky. Now the reason for that, if we switch it off for a moment, we can see in the background, and bear in mind the sky is the furthest thing away in this image, well, the next furthest thing is are these trees in the background, and they've got a bit of a blurred edge. So if the sky was sharp and that was blurred, that would be totally wrong. The sky has got to be at least as blurred as the furthest away part of this image, and that's that background area there. So we need to add a bit of blur to this image. Let's switch that back on. Just as I mentioned, we want to match it to the background blur that we see in the furthest point in this image. The sky is actually further away, so it certainly shouldn't be sharper than that area. So with that sky layer selected, we're going to go up and choose Filter and go to the Blur option, and we'll choose Gaussian Blur. Now, just a point to make here. When we open this box up, if you get an empty box there, that's because you're viewing the part of that layer at the bottom that has nothing on it, so other than the sky. So the sky starts there, so if you just drag that down, you'll find that there is some sky there. Let's get to something that's a bit more obvious in terms of its shape, so we can assess the blur. So that's 4.1. I would say that's something like about right. But use your own judgment on this. I'm going to go OK, and we can just switch that off. And I'm happy with that. It's probably a bit more blurred than that background horizon, or the trees on the horizon, so that should be about right. And if we wanted to go in and re-edit, we can just double click the filter, and we get that same box where we can re-edit. So now we're about ready to make a selection of the sky. So what we're going to do is switch the new sky off, and we want to make a selection that goes around what we can see here, because we want to mask off the bottom of this sky around the top of the foreground items. And this is where we're going to really see some of the things that, or some of the problems that we face. Now, notice I have got the layer selected, which is the actual truck layer. The reason is because we want to actually sample from that layer. So I'm going to go up to the Magic Wand tool. You might find it hidden under one of the other tools perhaps there. So just hold your mouse down to find that. And I'm just going to change the tolerance. I normally start with a tolerance of about 30. And we'll click in the sky and see what we get. Now, as you can see, There's a lot of spots and scratches and hairs and things in the sky, and the selection is isolating those, which we ideally don't want. So I'm going to undo or deselect that, I should say. So Command D or Control D, and just try a different tolerance. So let's go at the other extreme. Let's go to 10 and see what we get doing that. So obviously with 10, it's actually picking up more spots. Now you can add to your selection by holding down the Shift key and clicking over here. But in fact, you're going to have to then click quite a lot to get more. You could, with the Shift key held down, you could actually click into each individual hole or spot, but that's going to take a long time. So 10 is probably not what we want in the tolerance field at the top there. So let's deselect that and let's go to 15. See what that does. So 15 is actually not a lot better. I can shift click to add to it, and that does give a better option. But let's try 18. Not 118, but 18. That's better still because it's now going across the whole sky. I'm going to go back to, I had it on 20 and I was experimenting there while the video was paused. What I didn't try was 25. Let's just see what 25 does. Well, 25 is okay, but just look at what it's doing to the power pole. It's not really selecting any of that. So I think I will go back to 20. No, I won't. I'm going to stick to 25. That did seem to be a better solution. Although it also does depend on where you click in the sky, because it is a bit darker at the top than at the bottom. So, and don't click on a dark spot either, because that won't get you so much. So I'm happy with that as far as it goes. Now, the point to make here is that it's not picking up the power pole because it's such a faint tone, and it's almost not there in some places. The other thing to point out is there are some areas here it's not picking up, and I just want to make the point here that as far as I can see, that area there is a cottage because it looks like there's a chimney on top. Have a closer look. You might interpret it differently, but I would say that is a house. And this bit here, looking at the texture, I think that's part of the logs. So you might want to bear that in mind when you colour things up. Now, other students in the past have identified those differently and still done a good job of it. But so you may see them differently, but that's up to you. But it looks to me like that's a house and that's a log. So what are we going to do about all this stuff that we've got to improve upon? Well, first of all, before we do anything else, let's hold the Shift key down and click in the windows. So I've got the Shift key still held down and I'm able to add, and you can see that with the Shift key down you get a plus symbol appearing next to the magic wand cursor. I think there's a little area in there in the power pole that we need to grab as well, and we could go in a lot closer and decide that there might be some other areas around this lamp that we want to try and see what we get. Some of it disappeared. I'm going to undo that part of it. The nice thing is if you undo once, it just takes you back to the previous stage of your selection. So that is probably the best we're going to do for the moment. So how do we fix some of this, these spots and things? Well, if we go up to the rectangular marquee tool, and then again we're going to be swapping between holding the Shift key down. Notice when we do that we get a plus next to the cursor, and holding the Option key down, or the Alt key if you're on a PC. With the Alt key down we get a minus. So let's start with the plus because we want to add to the selection. Now if you just do that, you see that's added all those spots that we've missed, and it's added those to the selection. Now we haven't got these because we haven't gone down there, so we can do that again. Hold the shift key down, and obviously knowing this, you could actually zoom in quite a lot closer and do a lot of the detail in that way. So let's just see what we can do holding the shift key down and improving our selection. There's a bit to do. Whoops, let's not go over anything we want to retain. So I will just spend a little bit of time doing this. I'm tempted to pause the video because it's going to be a long video anyway. Let's do that, and I'll I'll be doing the same thing, just holding the shift key down and just drawing over all these spots. We can go inside the windows here as well, and I'll come back to the next stage shortly. Okay, right, I've gone through and just use that rectangular marquee tool with the shift key held down to just add to the selection and get rid of all those spots in the sky. So the next thing to point out is that's adding to the selection. We want to detract or remove from the selection, and to do that we hold on a Mac the Option key down, on a PC the Alt key, and you see we get the minus symbol next to the cursor. Well, when we do this, we could actually draw down the power pole, and we add all that to that power pole. And obviously it's useful that that power pole is pretty much upright, so those lines are vertical. So we can add to the image in that way. Not as easy with a curved shape. So I want to stick with the Option key or the Alt key and just remove from the selection and decide where you want to go to, maybe around about there perhaps, and maybe that if that is a chimney, I think it's got to be a chimney, we can build that. And then this area, which appears to me to be a log, sitting quite high in the truck at the back, we can do that kind of thing. So and then you might want to decide what's going on here. I'm not entirely sure. Maybe we can go back to remove it or adding to the selection, and which will in fact remove whatever that is. Okay, so that gets us to this stage, and at this point it's worth saying that that's not the only way to do this. Another way would be to start off with the mask, but leaving all the scratches and dots in place. Create a mask, start off with a selection I should say, and turn it into a mask, and then paint black on that mask. And remember, black on a mask hides, conceals, so we could actually spot out all these things on the mask that way. Now that to me sounds like a longer way, because with the rectangular marquee tool we can go over a large area in one go. But I think there could well be, because I've just seen a little spot there that I've missed, so let's just grab that. So there could well be some spots left that we might have to touch up, and as I speak I'm spotting some of them, but we can touch up on the mask in that way, just painting black on the mask once we've created a mask. I think I'm happy with what we've got so far, so let's go ahead and make a mask. So what we need to do is switch the sky back on and then actually select the sky. So obviously we've now selected the sky, and in fact, because we've got a selection here, we could actually just delete it, but of course that would be a destructive process. So we're going to use a mask to hide this area. We're going to go up to Layer and down to Layer Mask and Reveal Selection. So obviously that's hidden that part of the sky, and we can see that in the mask thumbnail. is really that shape. So it's masked out the whole of the bottom area and also around that selection that we created. Now, of course, it's not perfect. You know, if we look at the top of the tyre on the roof, that's a horrible edge there. We've got some pretty horrible bits around the power pole and some other areas that we're going to want to improve on. So how do we do that? Well, that's really where we need to start thinking about editing our mask. So we're going to be painting black to conceal and white if we need to reveal a part perhaps that we've masked that shouldn't be masked. So let's have a closer look at what we've got here. So you can see along the tree line we've really got a white edge that we want to try and lose. So how would we do that? Well, firstly we'll need to make sure that we've got the mask selected. So we don't want the actual image because we're going to adjust the mask. So make sure the mask is selected. A keyboard shortcut of D will give you black and white. And it's a great idea to get used to some of the keyboard shortcuts. And my favourite of all time is the save option, which is Command S on a Mac or Control S on a PC. You should be saving your work regularly, and by now you should have been saving your work at least 4 or 5 times, I would think, possibly more. So get used to that keyboard shortcut, and getting used to and remembering keyboard shortcuts is a key to using software more quickly. Now, the reason I'm saying this is because the one that I can never remember is how to enlarge and reduce my brush. So I always have to go to the option strip, but that's okay. So bearing in mind that black conceals and white reveals, we need to go in and change or remove some of these spots in the sky. So keep in mind that we've got a big white area if we look at the mask, which means that none of that is concealed. But those spots are going to be little black spots on the mask. So we've got to paint white over those. So let's change the foreground colour to white, and you see that we can start to remove those. Now that takes a little bit of getting your head around sometimes, working out what you need to do, whether it's black or white that you need to use. And we might just take the hardness right up, perhaps a slightly bigger brush, and that might be a little bit more effective in removing that. Maybe we get rid of that spot as well. And so have a look through the sky. There may well be spots that have been missed. Yep, up here we see. This is where you also need a clean screen. Is that a spot or is it a mark on the screen? Now, I've probably removed a little bit too much there, but we can also, let's just finish off a bit more of this first. In fact, I might just do that while the video is paused next, otherwise it's just going to take too long. But what I will say is that here we can use the polygonal lasso tool. So that is the one that I've got there, because we can find a straight edge there and chop off some of that area. So as soon as we go back to where we started, we get a selection. In fact, I might just deselect that because I noticed that I've got the feather selected to 10. Well, let's reduce that to 1 while we use the lasso or the polygonal lasso tool. So there I've got a selection, and go up to Edit and Fill, and I can choose white. Deselect, gives me a better edge, and we could do that down the power pole as well. So for example, let's find where that power pole should be. It looks like maybe with perspective it tapers a bit at the top. So why don't we do that? Try filling that with white. There we get a better edge. We might have to just sort out some of the little nicks in it. And we've got a feather of 1 on that, so that just about gives it an edge that's not quite as sharp as the one on the other side. So I would say let's do the same thing the other side. Just shave a bit off it. Okay, so we could obviously go around the rest of this power pole and sort it all out. Keep in mind that some of the detail here is actually part of the power pole. Those, whatever they are, insulators or something like that, isolators that sit on the top that the wires go to, we're going to need those at some point, so we may need to do a bit of rebuilding or restoring there. So you get the general idea. Now, where we've got a curve, that adds another challenge. So we might just start off by chopping the straight bit of the tyre. What do we want? Fill. Still filling with white. And at the other end, but what about the top of this that curves? Well, there's 2 ways we could do that. The first way would be to choose the brush tool, and we might have hardness, probably not any hardness, or maybe just a little bit, just add a slight bit of a feather perhaps, and then choose quite a large brush for 2 reasons. One is that it starts to match. Actually, that hardness I can see straight away is not going to work, so let's we want it at the other end, don't we? That's right, 100% hardness, or perhaps slightly less. That would be a better idea. So that's one way of doing it. Now, another way would be to use the pen tool, and we will have to use the pen tool later on to create the power lines that go to the power pole, and it would be my preferred way of doing it, but it depends on how proficient you are with the pen tool, of course. I mean, this is, if you're careful, this gives a reasonable result. And we'll have a look, take it down and have a look. You see, when we get to that size, it's not too bad. You can probably do a little bit better than that, but that is a reasonable result. What I will do when I get to demonstrate the power lines with the pen tool, I will, as part of that, just show you how to do the top of that tyre. But it's also worth saying that I do have a separate tutorial just on the pen tool. If you would like to see that, drop me an email if that's the case. Okay, while the video was paused, I've just done a bit more work on this power pole, just adding a bit of detail into the top with these, whatever the things are called that the wires go to, insulators or something like that. It depends on how detailed you want to get. I would really recommend with work like this that before you start, you do a bit of research. See if you can find a similar truck, see if you can find what old power poles look like, that kind of thing. You might want to be looking at logs and bark and that kind of thing, maybe old cottages. But particularly that the truck and the power pole would be useful, and how power lines actually look, because we've got an idea in our head, but often that's not accurate. And if you enjoy this kind of work, I know some of you will be tearing your hair out, but if you enjoy this kind of work, then you'll get better at it if you've got reference to work from. So just think about doing a bit of work around that power pole. A couple of things I want to show you as we do that, and let's just zoom in perhaps on this area here, because I realized as I was using the polygonal lasso tool, and let's just take a little bit out of this white part out. So I'm working on the mask and just creating a selection. And we've been filling that selection with white just to remove from the mask that we've got. So to speed the process up, I've just been using the keyboard shortcut, and it does help the process quite a bit in terms of how long it takes. So Shift, on a Mac I'm using Shift F5. Now I don't know if that's going to be the same on a PC, but you can have a look at that. If it's not, then it should give you under Edit, Fill, it may well list what the keyboard shortcut is. It certainly does on a Mac. Not sure if it does on a PC, but let's do that on a Mac. We're going Shift F5. We've got white selected, and I'm just hitting return then, and that speeds up that process quite a bit. One other thing I'll show you is that if we want to check how our mask is looking, with our mask selected, if we click on the mask and hold Shift Option down, or on a PC it's going to be Shift Alt, we get the mask in red, and that might just help to see if there are any spots or things that we've missed, and that's looking quite good. And if I click that again with Shift Option or Shift Alt, that takes it away. If I just hold Option down or Alt down and click, I get it in black. So again, that might be helpful. And I see just down here there's a little bit of grey. If you see grey, that's going to be partly transparent, which may be okay because that area across the treetops is kind of faded or blurred. So click again, Option click or Alt click will take you back there. Now the next thing I want to do is to come back to the sky, because really the sky doesn't match the same texture as we find in the original print. I mean, this is quite a gritty sort of low resolution texture in this this print. So what we want to do is add some noise to the sky to give it that same kind of effect. Now just note that there is a PDF for assignment C in the week 8 to 9 folder that's just about adding noise, so have a read of that. But I'm going to take you through two methods of adding noise. So it might be just worth you checking the time on the video, because I'm going to start the first method now, so you can maybe skip this method if you prefer the second method. So have a look at the video time, and from now I'm taking you through the first method to add noise to the sky. So the first thing we need to do is select the sky layer and make sure it's the actual sky and not the mask that you have selected. Okay, and we'll go up to filter and down to noise and add noise. So just to drag the image down so we can see the sky, find a cloud that's recognizable. And we can zoom into that and see what's going on. Now, you may well find that you don't have the monochromatic button selected here. So if that's the case, and it's likely that that is the case, you'll notice that if you zoom in, you can see a lot of RGB colors going on in there. And really we don't want that. If we click monochrome, that becomes a monochrome version, which is more in keeping with the old image. So we're on the Gaussian setting with monochromatic selected, and then you've really got to decide, well, how much noise do you want? And obviously you can go too far. That would be too much. So really it's something subtle, and quite subtle, I would say. That's 4.8. I'm going to take it down to 3. So you can see it's just giving it a bit of texture, but not really destroying the image. So let's click OK. Now the only thing here, if we blow this image up, we can see that in some of these darker areas particularly, the noise, I would say, is quite large. And these are quite tiny sort of speckles in the sky. So it would be really handy if we could actually blow that noise up. So I'm actually going to undo what I've done, because that's certainly one way of adding noise, and it's a simple way. Let's just take that out. So it's gone back to without noise. And this is not the second way, by the way. This is just improving this first way of adding noise. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new layer. And we're going to call it noise, because that makes sense. And I'm going to fill that with a grey. Now I can do that. I've obviously got that new layer selected. I can do that by going up to Edit and Fill. And one of the options I have is 50% grey, which is obviously a mid-grey. So that would be useful. So let's do that. And that floods that layer with noise, which we can switch off and on if we want to. Or I should say that floods it with grey. We're going to add the noise to that grey. So next stage is go to Filter and Noise and add noise. Now we've got it set to 3 and we thought that was okay. Monochromatic is selected, so we'll go OK. So that's added a monochromatic noise to that grey. So the next thing we want to do is blow that up so that the individual speckles of the noise or the grain is enlarged in keeping with the original print. So I'm going to select all, and keyboard shortcut for that is Command A. Under select you can find it at the top. Command A, or on a PC Control A, I believe. So that selects all. Then I want to go to transform, but I can do that with a keyboard shortcut. So transform is under Edit or Free Transform. I'm going to use Command T. On a Mac PC would be Control T. And I might need to just reduce or zoom out a bit here because I'm going to need to enlarge this actually quite a lot. I did do a test earlier and it needs to come up a fair bit to enlarge the noise. So if we take it to that, double click to apply, and let's just blow it up now, or zoom in I should say, and we can then have a look at what's going on. It could possibly come up a bit more, but I'm going to leave it at that, I think. So the next thing to do then is to go up to my blending modes, which the default is normal, and choose multiply. So that blends that layer with the rest of the image. And let's just deselect because I've got it selected. So Command D or Control D is deselect. Now the one thing now, of course, is that it's darkened the whole of the image. So two things we can do here. It would be really useful if we could have the mask that's on the sky masking out all the noise that's gone over the foreground area. And we can do that quite easily. And we can hold the Option key or the Alt key down, Option on a Mac, Alt on a PC. Actually, before we do that, just select the mask that's below the noise layer, then hold Option or Alt down and drag that mask up. And what that has done is duplicated that mask and added it to the top layer. So now you can see that all that noise that was going over the vehicle and the foreground is now masked out, and it's just on the sky. So one last thing we can do, because it has darkened the sky even quite a lot. So let's go back up to the noise layer and select the grey, not the mask, and we can just reduce the opacity of that layer. So if we drop it down, it will start to bring the sky back again, and retaining some of that noise just subtly in the background. Now it may be, with that in mind, and it depends on how far you go with that, with the opacity, too far and you lose the noise altogether. Too much and the sky is a bit too dark. So you may even feel that you want to lighten your sky, having viewed this video and in preparation for this process. But that is the process for adding noise the first way. So you can check the video time, and I'm going to start the second method now. What I'm going to do, just before I do that, is I'm going to revert back to saved. So I saved my file before I started this part of the process, the noise part. So I can go back to File, and where are we? Revert will take me back to the last time I saved the file. So we'll now move on to the second method. And this has some benefits over the first method. So I do need to have that noise layer created. So I'm just going to recreate quickly my noise layer. So new layer, call it noise, fill it with 50% grey. I'm doing this quickly. Add the noise, and then select all, transform, which was Command T or Control T. So we're blowing the noise up quite a bit more than last time, I think. Double click to apply and deselect my selection. So then I need to duplicate the mask. I need to select the grey and grey thumbnail and change the blending mode to multiply and just reduce that opacity down. So we did all that in the previous method. But what we're going to do now, which is a bit different, is we're going to create a folder or a group. So down at the bottom of the layer palette we have an icon which looks like a folder, and it says create a new group. So we're going to do that, and it puts a group at the top of the layer palette. Now, and we've got a little arrow there that opens the folder up, and you can see that since nothing is opening up, that group or that folder is empty at the moment. So let's open it, because what we're going to do is we're going to drag a noise layer and our sky layer into that folder. So let's start with the noise. Just click on the the grey thumbnail, and drag it into that folder. And you see when I do that, that layer is now inset slightly from the edge, indicating that it's within that folder. And at the moment the sky is outside of it, so it's not inset. But we want that in the group as well. So we're going to do the same thing, drag that into that group. And you now see that the sky and the grey noise layer are both inset and inside that group. Now I want my noise above my sky. Okay, so that's both within that group. We can actually turn that or close it, and we'll see they disappear. So now this can be a useful way of managing our layers, especially if there's an effect on a layer that we don't want to be applied to the whole of our image. So we can isolate those effects within a group. So what we're going to do now is delete the mask that is over or within the noise layer. So if we select the mask and we go Control, delete layer mask, and that will be also controlled on a PC, I believe. So we lose the layer mask there. Then we come to the other layer mask because they were identical. And that seems to be a bit overkill, having two masks that are identical. So what we can do is we can drag this mask up to the group. And you see now that mask is applied to everything within that group. And you can see now that it's done exactly the same thing visually. The noise is masked out along with the sky. Now, one big benefit of this is if we still had to retouch things in the sky, which are affected by that mask, we haven't got to edit two masks. We've only got to edit one mask. So I think that is a better method of doing the noise. But you have two methods there, and do please check the time on the video so that you can perhaps disregard the first method if you want to use the second one. Let's think about adding some colour to the truck. The first thing I'm going to do is create a new layer, and we'll call it Colour 1. And I don't know where that would have been created on your file, but it's put it in the folder. I don't want it in the folder. I'm going to drag it to the top of the layer palette. So it's not in the folder. You can see it's not inset. The files, or the layers I should say, that are in the folder are inset. So I've got a layer, an empty layer at the top of the layer stack. I'm now going to pick a colour for my truck, and I was playing earlier with a dark red, so let's choose something else. Let's go for maybe a turquoisey sort of aqua colour, but with a bit of depth to it. Now this is where a bit of research will help you. What sort of colours were authentically used on that model of truck? Red is a good option, but green and other colours are just as authentic. Next step is to create a selection, and to do this we're going to use the existing mask. So select the mask, and we can control click this, and we're going to select add mask to selection. So if we do that, we see that the mask becomes a selection. Now we want to choose the layer where we're going to apply the colour. So go back to our Colour 1 layer, and if we choose a paintbrush, now of course at the moment we're painting in the sky, which is obviously not right. Let's undo that. What that means is we've got to select the inverse of what we've selected. So we can go up to select and select inverse, but Shift Command or Shift Control I is a better option or a quicker option. So we do that, we find that it's now selected everything else, and I could draw on the cab, which is the colour or the area that I want to paint. Now there's a few ways that we can do this. We can actually just blow up the image and paint to some degree manually, because we've got the outer edges masked, but we're going to have to find things like windows and start to draw straight edges across things, which could be tricky. We've got to go across the top but not onto the tyre. And if I just stop there for a minute and just point out that that's a solid colour, obviously, but we can do some things with that. We can apply a blending mode, so I would suggest have a look at colour, which then is really blending the colour on that layer with all the other layers. Now, as you colour things up, experiment with some of the other options, and you'll find that some maybe overlay have some benefits as well. So you might find that in certain areas a different blending mode works better. I'm going to stick to colour for this one, and I've also got the option of reducing the opacity. So, you know, if it's still a bit too strong, we can drop it down, and really we're looking for a subtle look. Depends on what the overall result is that we're looking for. If we want to create an illustration from this photograph, maybe a stronger approach, stronger colours would be right. But if we're colouring up, or hand tinting, used to be called, an old print, the vibrancy of colours shouldn't really be there. We're looking for something subtle. So I don't think I'm going to mark you down if your image is too bright, but just keep that in mind, that it's probably a better effect to go for subtle rather than bright. So the other thing I want to do is just to say that another method we can choose, rather than, and it's probably a bit quicker, is find that bucket tool, which is probably hidden under your gradient tool, but in the tool panel, and click in the selected area, and that's going to fill everything. So it may just be a quicker option to fill everything and then go to the eraser tool and give yourself quite a large brush with let's say 0 hardness, maximum hardness. We don't want to fade to this, and then just erase what we don't need. So we want to colour up the cab in this instance, not the power pole. So we could obviously colour the truck manually, is what I'm trying to say. So draw straight lines and get them as straight as we can. I would suggest that perhaps a better option is to use the polygonal lasso tool, but we might find that just doing some curves might be okay with a large brush, and might need to turn my layer palette off so I can see what I'm doing. So we could get perhaps a curve across the top. Again, as I demonstrate the pen tool, and you might want to watch the pen tool tutorial and ask me for the link to that. You can use the pen tool to create some curves and turn those shapes into a selection. So doing that would be an easier way of selecting a curved shape. But another way we can work on this this coloured area is to use the polygonal lasso tool, as I mentioned, and we need to be thinking about which one of these icons we select up in the options strip, because they all do different things. If we're just creating a new selection, the first one is the default. But because we've already got a selection, we want to be adding to it or subtracting from it, and that's what these options do up here. So we've got one in particular that, if I mouse over it, subtract from selection. So I choose that one, and I do have to work it out which one is correct. Often I do one and it's not right, and I realise no, it should have been the other one. That's kind of, for me anyway, a usual method of working in Photoshop, you know how to do something roughly, and often have to redo it just to choose the right icon or the right setting. So if we did this and just picked out that area, for instance, and notice when you do get over the starting point, the icon changes. At the moment it's a minus and it changes to a 0. So now I'm going to zoom out, and if I delete, I realize that that's not the right area I want to delete. So I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to go to inverse, which is Shift Command I or Shift Control I, and now when I do that, the correct area will disappear. And I'm often doing that, deleting an area, realizing no, it's the actual inverse I need to delete. So if you're finding that is happening a lot, don't worry, it happens to me as well. So we can, by doing this, we can go over various areas. So this interior, or this window that looks into the interior, we want perhaps to colour that area differently. And I notice I've got a bit of a line that I need to deal with where I put a colour in previously. But let's just pick out this. And that, in fact, needs to be, I would say, one of the other settings. Let's try again. Okay, now, which way round is that going to be? If I delete that, that's correct. Okay, that's working. I don't want to delete my overall selection, but I will just inverse it, because I notice I've got a line there that I don't want, and I should just be able to paint that out with a bit of colour. That comes from colour that I previously put in. Okay, so if I just deselect that, that's giving you an idea how that is going to look. I've got some more work to do just to remove some other areas, and how much detail you put into this is up to you. The more detail, the better it will look, and I guess the better your grade will be, because I can then tell actually how much time have you put into this or put aside for this. One or two little points I can see to touch up. Another thing you can do to just add some simple detail is to choose the eraser tool with quite a small brush, and let's just blow in a bit and pick out some small areas like this hook. It would be quite easy just to either put a different colour in, maybe a gold, or just pick that out, and you can do that with some of these rivets, whatever they are. And it starts to take on a bit of realism when you start to do that. Maybe the hinges as well. It's a lot of detail, but actually it's actually quite easy to do it. So we've got to cut out the that aqua colour from the interior of the cab and think about what other colours we can put in. Some flesh tones for the face and the hand, colouring up the suit, and maybe a different colour for the tie. Some of that will be fairly easy to do because you can do it without masking. And that may be the case with some of the logs as well. Try and think about not making the logs too uniform. They're not going to be all exactly the same colour. The bark is going to be a different colour to the sawn parts. You've got to think about the background, colouring that, thinking about the edge of the background, so where the trees are, is going to be a softer edge. Now I've got a bit of a white outline around mine at the moment, so if I was spending more time on this, I would be trying to lose that and perhaps soften the edge of the trees so that they look a bit blurred. And I think a lot of those shapes in the background will be blurred shapes. So when you make a selection, if you've got your polygonal lasso tool, if that's one of the ways you're making a selection, you might want to increase the feather a bit just to soften the edge. If you're doing it freehand and you're using a brush, then reduce the hardness down so you've got a soft edge to that. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how to colour this image. Obviously I can't do it all because it's just going to be a mammoth video. There are some other options when working with colour. One is thinking about just breaking up this colour that we've got and adding a bit more shadow in. Now when we talk about shadows, particularly with a blue sky, there's going to be quite a bit of blue in shadows. And I'm looking at this area on the bonnet where we could perhaps add a shadow. So let's create a new layer and we'll call it shadows. Now we might want to do all our shadows on one layer. We might find that particularly if we want to apply different effects, we have to split them across more than one layer. But let's create a new layer called shadows at the top of our layer palette, and we're going to choose a blue. So click on the foreground colour to our colour picker and maybe darkish blue. So I've got that picked. Then we'll use the polygonal lasso tool, and I'm just going to close my layers down so I can see what I'm doing. And I'm going to just go up this area of the bonnet. Now the polygonal lasso tool draws in straight lines, and we've got a curved one here. So if you want to get close to a curve, you just need a few more points. And we'll come down there, round the headlight and the mudguard, so that we create a selection, find the end, around the bonnet. So then I'm going to go to check I'm on the right layer. Yes, I am. Go to the paintbrush tool and just with a reasonable sized brush and making sure there's no hardness, so it's got a soft edge, I'm going to just put in a bit of shadow. Now it doesn't look great at the moment, of course, but if we go to the layers palette, and we've got two options. One is the blending mode. Well, we already know that colour is useful, but that doesn't really look right for a shadow. But multiply, if we choose multiply and reduce the opacity right down, and it's up to you where you leave it, but that just adds in a little bit more variety into the colours that you're using to create a bit of shadow. So that's one thing that you can consider, and you might look around the image and where else you can do that. It's always tricky putting colour into the darker areas, so do try different blending modes. The other thing I want to mention is just selecting a colour, but more specifically, if you've already created a colour like we have on this cab, and you can't remember what exact colour that was, go to the eyedropper tool, make sure you choose the correct layer, so our colour is on colour 1, but also make sure or check what you've got in the options strip. So if you've got all layers or current and below, just switch it to just the current layer. So if it's just on the current layer, you can select that colour and it will tell you exactly what that colour was. And that's without any of the opacity reduction or blending mode. So you can then recreate that colour, either adding to this or putting it somewhere else. We want to put in these power lines that come out of the power pole and lead to the insulators or isolators, these little things that sit at the top. And there will be several lines. I'm going to do one, but you're going to want to put quite a few lines in here, maybe something coming down from the light as well, and also taking them on the other side too. So they come out of the picture on the left, but they'll go across the picture to the right, and when we get to the tyre, really they're going behind the tyre. So my suggestion is when you draw the line, go right across the tyre, because we'll be on a separate layer, and then erase the part that's on the tyre. If you try and draw the line and stop at the tyre and start on the other side, it just won't look as if it carries on through. So you might have to do that with a few of the paths that you create, and you may well also be able to duplicate the path. So let's have a look at the pen tool. So here we've got it. If we hold the mouse down, we see there are several different tools, and if you're familiar with Adobe Illustrator, you'll know that those are, I think, identical to the tools you get in Illustrator. And Illustrator is quite a good program for certainly drawing up shapes, and it has more to offer in terms of type manipulation as well. So I often find I'm doing things in Illustrator and bringing them into Photoshop, so they work quite nicely together. But we can draw these paths in Photoshop, so let's create a new layer so that we're working non-destructively, and we'll call that wires. And let's, wherever it's appeared in your layer palette, let's put it at the top of our layer stack. And let's just blow this up a little bit, or zoom in, and we'll look at this area. So I'm going to choose, so I've got the pen tool chosen actually. So let's start at the power pole, roughly where one of those isolators is. We're clicking and dragging. So when you do that, you'll notice you get these handles. Now, I haven't let go of my mouse yet, so I'm going to let go now. And I'm going to come off the edge of the image. So don't click at the edge, go right off the edge and click and hold and drag. So what that does is it gives us a curved line rather than a straight line. If I just delete that and click with a straight line, you'll see we get similar to what the polygonal lasso tool does, and we can join up and get a closed shape. Now that's a path. At the moment it's an uncolored path. And if we go into our paths palette, we'll see that we get a work path, and we can just about make out that path indicated on the thumbnail. If I want to switch that path off, if I click away from the highlighted work path into the area underneath, it disappears. But to bring it back, click again and it appears again. Notice it's unselected when it appears again. So you're going to want to work with the two selection tools, mainly the direct selection tool. If we choose the path selection tool, we're selecting the whole of the path. So I'll deselect by just clicking away, but it's still visible because it's still selected in the path palette. If I choose the direct selection tool and click on the path, you notice all those anchor points are now empty, and they're empty because they're individually editable. Okay, so you don't worry about drawing your path accurately, because you can go in and edit it, and then once the path is drawn, if I just go to the path selection tool, so now you'll see all those anchor points are full, and we can move it around if we want to. So we're selecting the whole of the path, and in the path palette we've got some icons at the bottom, and if you mouse over them it will tell you what they do. So fill a path with a foreground color. The one we're going to want to use is stroke a path. So I'll come on to that in a minute, but those are icons that we want to get to. So I'm just going to delete that straight edge path, come back to my layers palette, because we want to draw a curve. So back to the pen tool, click and drag to get the handles. Now these curves are called Bezier curves, this method of drawing with these handles. Now notice I'm just putting two curves in, or sorry, two anchor points in, and that's creating a curve, a nice smooth curve between the 2 points. If you put an anchor point in the middle, any anchor point gives the curve the opportunity to change direction. Now we don't want that curve to change direction, we want it to be a nice smooth curve. So we're going to just come down to the direct selection tool, click away, and reselect so those handles become visible, and we can adjust to where we want that sag on that wire to be. So the more points you put in, the more wiggly your path is likely to be. So I really think you only need one anchor point at either end. So once we've got that path in place, and you'll notice we've gone just over the edge, we're probably going to want to end that path just where the start of the power pole, the cross beam, whatever you call that thing, starts. So we're going to be able to erase that later on. Right, we now need to add some kind of colour to this path that we've got. And just let's be aware that when we click away in the paths palette, we don't see the path on our image, but it is still there. I can switch it on, but it's still not selected. So just be aware that we need to actually click on the path to select it. And then we see the anchor points at either end. While I'm in the path palette, it's worth also mentioning in the menu for the paths that you can save a path, and that means that that path or multiple paths will be available when you close down Photoshop and then reopen. So it might be worth doing that, and then obviously you could name that path. You can also, if you've created a path that is actually a closed shape, you can turn that into a selection. So a few things are available there while you're in the path palette. So we've got the path selected. Let's just double check that we have a layer selected. We are on the wire layer, that's correct. And then we need to go to the paintbrush tool. And when we do that, we see in the options strip that we have a thickness available to us. At the moment, it's 12 pixels, I think. So if I go to the paths palette and the icons at the bottom, this second one in is stroke path with brush, and we can see that that's added that that black color to the path. However, 12 pixels is too thick, so we're going to undo that and reduce that down, and probably quite a lot, maybe to about 4. And let's try that again, see how that looks. Let's switch off the path so we can see the line, and let's just zoom out. Maybe that's still a bit thick. I'm going to undo that, select the path once more, and just take it down to 3, I think, and stroke, and that's a bit more like it. Now, I do go into more detail, as I mentioned, with the with my pen tool tutorial. So I think I'll leave the detail of what else you can do with the pen tool and the techniques of using it to that video. But looking at this line, I'd like to do a bit more to it just to make it a bit more realistic. Now, I would say that this point here at the edge of the image would be closer to us than the telegraph pole, power pole. So that line should get thicker and should be thinner at the other end. Now we can do that in Illustrator, but we're not looking at that program. So what can we do in Photoshop? Well, there are some things we can do. If I just come out of the paths palette, I make sure I do have the wires layer selected. So we're going to use the liquefy filter. So we'll come up to the filter menu and liquefy, and we get this new window that opens just with what is on our wire layer, and that's just the one wire. Now we've got some tools over on the left, and the two that we want to consider are the pucker tool and the bloat tool. The pucker tool is going to squash things down, make things narrower. The bloat tool is going to do what it suggests and blow things up and enlarge things. So let's just start with the pucker tool. And over on the right, we've got some options for changing the brush size. And I'm going to stick with something fairly large and hope that it doesn't move this line around too much. That's going to be the tricky thing. But in order to stop that, or at least reduce that, let's make sure that the pin edges box is checked. So if I just, without actually moving the mouse, that's will help us. So I'm just going to click without moving the mouse and click repeatedly, and you can see that line is beginning to get a bit thinner. So we can move it down a bit, but I might just undo that because I think that's probably enough. If we leave it in one place without moving the mouse and clicking, you get the least amount of movement to the line, which we really want to try and avoid. So let's go to the other end and choose the bloat tool, because this is the end we want to be thicker because it's closer to us. And just think about where the center of your brush is, and without moving the brush, click and click repeatedly, and that is thickening up. If I move the brush, I think that this will probably put a kink in the line. Well, it's not too bad at the moment. Let's leave it at that. And we'll click OK. And now we can see that we've got a slightly thicker line going to thinner at the other end. So the last thing I'm going to do is just zoom into the power pole, and with the eraser tool, with a small brush with hardness up to maximum, just clip that to the edge of the power pole. So that's part of the job done. Let's zoom in a bit further, and we're going to put another line in, why don't we just save this line, because let's select that one and save the path. So we might call it wire 1. So, and deselect just by clicking down here. So we're going to draw another path, and it's just going to have a slight curve to it, and it's going to do something like that, just joining the two insulators, and that's probably good enough. So we'll make sure we're on our paintbrush tool. We've got 3 pixels already selected up in the option strip. We've got black ready to go, so we can just make sure that wire path is that wire layer, I should say, is selected. If you don't have a layer selected, it won't allow you to do this. So we'll click, and that looks a bit soft, but we'll live with that, I think. And just clip the end of that . Okay, probably if you've got a slightly lighter sky, that would be a bit more visible. So that's one wire put in. Now, it's probably worth saying that if I go back to my paths palette and select the first wire, come down to my path selection tool, that's the black one, not the white one, select it and hold the option key down, I can duplicate it. So you haven't got to draw it again, but you will need to edit it though, because it's not really going to be the same curve as the previous path. So then go to your direct selection tool, click away so it's deselected, select again, and you'll get some handles, and you can revise the shape and go through the same process. Now, it's worth pointing out that you can also duplicate the path that you've actually stroked. So to do that, just deselect the paths in the paths palette. So we're left with the one that's actually stroked. And come to your mover tool and just check the options strip as well, because usually auto select is checked. Now with auto select, if you click, you're likely, if you miss the path, to accidentally select the sky and move the sky, which you don't want to do. So if you uncheck auto select, it's only going to be selecting the thing that's on that one layer. And we can move that around, but in the same way that we duplicated a path, we can duplicate a stroked path by holding the Option key down, or the Alt key on a PC, and that way you can duplicate your stroked path. However, I would suggest, and notice that it's duplicated the little extra bit there as well, but I would suggest that you don't do that, because really you're going to want to edit that path first. So probably a better way is to duplicate the path and then stroke it, rather than try and duplicate an already stroked path. So let's undo that. So that's a few tips for the pen tool and the power lines. We've got to have a look at the text that goes in on the door. So let's see how we work with text. And it's worth saying again about Adobe Illustrator that has a lot more functionality as far as manipulating text goes, and you can import this image into Illustrator, place it on the page and work over the top of it to add in the type there. So if you happen to have Illustrator and you wanted to try that, you can do that, and if you need help, drop me an email. But we're just going to work in Photoshop. That's what this paper is all about. So the first thing we're going to do is select the type tool, and as soon as we click on the image, a couple of things happen. It automatically creates a new layer for us and puts some placeholder text or dummy text in, which is Latin, which is what is normally used for dummy text. So just be aware when you have the type tool selected that every time you click on the image, it will create another type layer. So if you've got a bit of a twitch on your finger, you might have a whole load of type layers created. So just be aware of that. You might have to delete one or two. So we've got one type layer selected. If we go to the mover tool, and which deselects the type, we'll see that it's in white. And why is that? Or if we go back to the type tool, we see that in the options strip, we've got an option for changing the color. It's white is selected at the moment, and I'm going to stick with white because that's going to stand out pretty well, but you want a color that is going to be pretty noticeable. So we've got some other options here. We've got a place where we can choose our font and what weight of font. I would suggest going with something reasonably bold, and I've particularly chosen a font that's got a serif to it. That's these small feet at the edges of the type, just because that gives it a more traditional old style look to it, but that's up to you. We've got point size here as well, which we can adjust for the right size. So once we've got that in place or typed in, let's type it in. Let's change the Latin to J. Done. And we can go to the mover tool and then move it into position. Now, once it's in position, we need to be aware that there's some perspective going on here. If we look at the top of the door, we would imagine that it should line up with the top of the door, but actually because it's a bit lower, perhaps it won't line up exactly. But looking at the bottom of the door, yeah, that looks a bit wider at that end than it does that end. So just be aware of perspective, and we're just going to highlight this text again with the type tool, because we want to put an arc into this type. And if we look up at the option strip when we have the type tool selected, We've got one that is a transform tool, so it's going to create warped text for us. So if we click that, we get an option to warp the text. Now nothing is selected at the moment, but we've got a menu of lots of options, and the arc one at the top is going to be something that we're going to want to use. And we've got some further adjustments we can do, so how much that is arced. We've got horizontal and vertical, but let's stick to what we need. And we can also adjust, because at the moment that's a symmetrical arc, we can adjust how that looks. So we would imagine that the front of the vehicle is a bit closer to us than the back, so we want perhaps to see that on the horizontal distortion just bloating out a bit at the front. If I do that a lot, you'll see what I mean, but it just wants to be a little bit, just to give a feel of being closer to us. So let's click OK and just come off the type tool so that we can see how that looks. And it's probably still a little bit large. So let's reduce that down in point size a bit more. It's pretty small already, but go to 4 point, and that's perhaps too small. Let's try 4.5. And not 0.5. Let's go. There we go. 4.5. I'm going to live with that and just reposition that. So I'm happy with that for the moment. I can go to transform and rotate and just think about rotating slightly. That looks good to me. Now, there's a couple of other things that we can do to this to add a bit more realism to it. First of all, we might want to play with the opacity. So let's drag that down. Just so that it sits back into the picture a bit more. Now the other thing is that where this type goes across these wooden slats, you would expect that there's a groove in there, and you would expect that that would either distort the type, or actually the type would just go across it and there'd be a gap, or the paint I should say would go across it and there would be a gap in the groove. How would we do that? Well, the first thing we would need to do, at the moment this layer is like a smart object, and all the time it is as such. We can highlight it and adjust it as type, but we want it to be an image so that we can distort it and play with it a bit more. So I would say, first of all, if you want to come back and edit it as type, you might want to make a copy of this, and you can just go to the layers palette menu and duplicate layer, and then switch that one off. I'm just going to do it straight on this, which is a destructive process just on this layer. So the first thing I need to do is hold the control key down and click the text, and I'm going to rasterize the type. What that means is it's going to turn it into an image rather than text. And just to point out that if you control click the thumbnail, you get a different menu to control clicking the text or probably the rest of the layer. So when we do that, choose rasterize type, and you see that that layer is now just a normal layer. You can also find that up in layer and rasterize. We've got some options there, but I've done it now through control clicking or probably right clicking on a PC. So now it's an image that we can play with. So if we wanted to remove some of the type that's falling between the slats, I would do this with the pen tool, and we'll draw a narrow shape. Now, bearing in mind we've got the image blown up quite a bit, we might want to make that a bit wider. So just come to your direct selection tool, click away, and reselect so that the anchor points are empty, and then we can make it a little bit wider perhaps. And I think I want to move that as well, so I'll go to my path selection and just okay. So now I've got a path in place. I go to the paths palette, to the paths menu, and make selection. So that's turning that path, we'll just go OK, into a selection, which I can just now delete from that layer. So I can hit delete, and that removes that part of the text, and I'll deselect and just to zoom out and see how that's looking. It's subtle, but if you did that on every part of the letter that fell on those gaps, it would perhaps give it a nice effect. You could also try the liquify tool and working in those small areas, but another option would be to, if we blow up or zoom in and choose the smudge tool, we could try just pulling some of this text, and some of it may get distorted or fragmented as it goes into those areas. So but this is really a case of experimenting and seeing what looks right. It's a small detail, but for me, probably removing the bits across the slat grooves is the most effective. So you need to put in the phone number at the bottom as well. So that will then be probably the last step in the work. With any job like this, it's important to take regular breaks from your computer. Working for an hour, then taking a short break is advisable. I'd suggest have a coffee. It's always a good idea to self-manage and have a little reward, maybe a chocolate bar or a chocolate biscuit that you have when you've got to a certain stage. Do this in stages. Don't try and get it all done in one day. Come back to it. You have got 2 weeks to do this project. Don't forget that the end result, when you've finished, needs to be a JPEG. So make sure you are saving your work regularly. There's a lot of work here that you could lose if you're not doing that. Save your work regularly as a PSD. When you're finally happy with the end result, go to the layers palette and flatten your layers and save as a JPEG, and then upload the JPEG. And that's pretty much all I'm going to show you for now. Keep in mind that there is, in the study guide, at the end, there's an example of how it should look. I think that was a B grade or a B plus grade or something like that. So there's the opportunity to do better than that. It will take time. So you've got a lot of colouring up to do and paths to create. You've got some work to do inside the cab and on the logs. But the end result is great fun, and you'll need some patience for it.